And I have the great moment of introducing Herbert Takmazon and his thesis and his work. And I was thinking about Herbert, and I came up with the image of the little grain of sand that starts the pearl. And I thought that was a really apt image to describe the relationship to this question that has been something you've lived with for a really long time. And the question is consciousness localized in the physical body and the present moment, or is it non-localized, transcending physical confines of matter and time? That's a big question. And so his topic, Herbert says, was seeded at his early age, so he's been thinking about this for a long time. He stated that synchronistic events in my life had sparked an interest in this field long ago, and the question of whether consciousness is localized only in the brain or can it transcend the brain's physical limitations has been alive and tended to in various ways. In exploring this topic, he actually allowed himself to be informed by dreams, memories, stories, and a tremendous body of research, covering such areas as the collective unconscious, synchronicity, parapsychology, shamanism, and quantum physics. Not a light load. His research is a wonderful contribution to the field of depth psychology, and I, for one, am very happy that you did this work. And so I am very honored to introduce you, Herbert, and your thesis titled Non-Local Consciousness, Transcending Material-Based Sensory Perception.
Can you help me figure this out? I made a PowerPoint and I was hoping I could do it last week so I could send it to the AD guy, but I did it this morning, but I forgot about this. There's going to be a lot of slides, like 100 slides of text. So.
Want me to read it off?
No, you're going to do that. I'm just going to stand here.
That was last week. You were supposed to turn it in, but your work sense of time and continuity.
Exactly.
Yeah. Now,
This should work. I've done it before.
okay, great.
Second, get back into the mode of this stuff. I've been thinking about this for so long to do the presentation, I'm kind of sick of it. So I just need to get back into it for the last time so I can just dump it. So non-local consciousness and material-based sensory perception. That's kind of what it sounds like to read that title. It's kind of what it is to me. So, I'm going to talk about my interests, why I kind of got into this field, why I wanted to talk about this. And it started a really long time ago. I think I was about 8 years old or something, and I had to put the marker barbecue, remember what that memory was. So we were at a barbecue in our apartment, and my dad and our other neighbor were talking about like money, I think. And I asked him, what's the largest number? I'm like, is it a billion, is it a zillion? And they said that it just keeps going, it never ends. And so for the first time, I kind of stopped for a moment, I visualized this hype just going on and on and on, just wouldn't end. And I came back into the present moment, and I realized something changed in me. Something kind of ruptured in my understanding of everything. And I kind of scared me. And then again, when I was in 10th grade, we went to Palm Springs, and my brother and my cousin and I were sitting by the pool on those beach chairs, and we were just staring into the sky and talking about, God and time and all that stuff. And the notion that God, I'm not preaching religion of any sort. I'm just saying when religions talk about God, He always was and always will be, and just kind of trying to contain that thought. And again, I think something happened. I couldn't understand what it was, but I felt like something weird thing was happening to me. And then finally, I had a strange experience about 7 months ago. I was coming home. I parked my car. I'm walking out. I was in a really, really emotional state of mind. I had a very specific thought. I mean, a very specific thought. Okay. In the morning, I wake up to a text message from my friend, And he said that, he's like, Herb, I had a dream. It was so vivid, it was so real. And he explained exactly what I thought the night before. And it was, I can't talk about it because it was really personal, but he told me the exact thing I thought of. He dreamt of that exact thing. That's really weird. So, this man, Dr. Amit Goswami, he's a theoretical quantum physicist from the University of Oregon. His documentary on the quantum activists is what kind of pushed me to finally do this, do this thesis. So one day he gets an email from this guy from the University of Mexico. The guy is a neurophysiologist. He says, listen, I have all this information, I have all this data from experiments we did. We don't know what to do with it. Can you please come here and try to analyze it? So he goes down there. Turns out they would get participants in pairs to sit across from one another with these electrodes on their heads, and they would meditate for like 15, 20 minutes. And then they'd separate them, put them in these Faraday chambers. It's a chamber that doesn't allow any electromagnetic radiation to go in or out. And they found that, well, yeah, they put them in those chambers individually, apart from one another, and they would put a monitor in front of one of the participants, and they would project images. And the other participant was just sitting there. And they had electrodes on them, and they were recording brainwave activity the entire time. So something interesting happened. This is just a random image, but I figured this would be the best way to illustrate what I was trying to say. So one person that's seeing the images flash on screen, the visual cortex does some sort of like pattern that corresponds to the image. Well, they found out that other participants' visual cortex started to fire the same way, but he wasn't seeing anything. That's really weird. How can someone see something and elicit a pattern and they're aware that they're seeing that thing, because obviously there's a pattern in their brain to signify that they're seeing something, but the participant away from him in another room in which there's no way a signal can be transmitted to him has the same neural pattern being fired, but he doesn't know that that's happening. All that is unconscious to both of them. So that is non-local consciousness, that you're able to perceive something without being there, that the senses aren't informing it. So consciousness is not constrained by the physical boundaries of the brain and body. And that means that it's not localized in space. And you know that space and time are interdependent, right? So if it's not localized in space, then it's not localized in time. And a lot of studies show, there's a lot of evidence for that, I'm not going to get into that. But the mind is non-local, can transcend time and space, and it can tap into this omnipresent field of force, and this thought extends all the way back to the Buddhist era from like 400 BCE. So it's nothing new. It's just a different way of looking at it now. So let's talk about consciousness. In my effort to understand what it was, I found more information on what it is now. And this really awesome psychologist, Julian Jaynes, from I think the 80s, he provided a lot of evidence showing the unnecessary and the undesirable nature of consciousness. So, is it a cognitive experience? Turns out it is not. That conscious memory is not a storing up of sensory images. Because when you think of something, all these things are morphed into other images and memories. So it's not just a stacking of sensory images, it's more than that. Then he said, is it the basis and a requisite for learning? And they did some really cool study. So they got a bunch of participants, they said, we're going to take you into a room, we're going to put some music, and you're going to select the songs that you think are better. But before we do that, we're going to take you to the cafeteria, we're going to give you some lunch, and during lunch, they play the music in the background.
Yeah.
And the participants selected the songs that they heard at lunch as better, songs. And some of them were aware that they heard it in the cafeteria, and some were not aware that they had heard it in the cafeteria. But they still made that association that this song is better than other songs. Well, they found something really weird. When people became conscious of the contingency between the two stimuli, when they were aware that this is what they're trying to find out, they wouldn't learn. They would choose other songs. There was no statistically relevant data showing that people like this song versus that song. It was just random. People selected random music. So consciousness actually inhibits learning of a certain kind. Now, side note on commercials, there's this image, beautiful images like sea, sailboat crashing in the waves, dog, this handsome man, beautiful girl, they're running around like, God, it's so beautiful. And all of a sudden, blank screen, Calvin Klein, Eternity. It's like, what in God's name does that have to do with anything? It's a stupid cologne. Turns out, they're hacking into your brains and trying to get you, next time you're at the mall or the store, to think about, when you see that product, you're going to feel good. Like, I don't know, I have a good feeling about this. Well, yeah, it's because they just hacked into your brain and they made you unconsciously connect this product to a thought, an emotion from your past. So, but now that you're aware of it, it's not going to happen to you again. So, the older belief that conscious experience is the substrate of all learning is completely false. That's not true. So is consciousness thinking and reasoning? Well, it turns out that one does one's thinking before one knows what one is to think about. That's a weird statement. I don't like that, quote that, hence the quotations. So the actual process of thinking is not conscious. Only its preparation, its materials, and its end results are consciously perceived. So what does that mean? You know that whole image of the scientist sitting there, with a set of problems using induction, deduction to figure out the world's problems? Do you know how mythical that is? That's as mythical as a unicorn. That's complete bullshit. That's not real. That's not how it works. How it actually works is this. This guy, Carl Gauss, he's a mathematician. For years, he was trying to prove this mathematical theorem. He couldn't do it. And this is what he said. Like a sudden flash of lightning, the riddle happened to be solved. It's as if I myself cannot say what was the conducting thread that connected what I previously knew with what made my success possible. Consciousness is not necessary for reasoning. Reasoning is a dark, deep into huge discovery that has no representation in consciousness. It is sometimes almost you have to forget the problem for it to be solved. So now, just really quickly, consciousness is not to be confused with reactivity, sensory perception, performance of skills. Imagine playing the piano, or more often I'm playing soccer, my brother's criticizing me, stop thinking about it. Well, when you're conscious of something, you can't perform a complex skill, like dancing and whatnot. Consciousness is not necessary for speaking, reading, writing, listening. It's not a copy of experience. It's not involved in Pavlovian learning, not involved in learning any skills. It's not necessary for judgments or simple thinking, reasoning, or critical thinking, or creative thinking, I'm sorry. And it has no location except an imaginary one. So this is a really interesting thing, that consciousness has an imaginary location. It's not really localized anywhere. So what is consciousness? What could it be? And the modern, more the physicalist, materialist branch of philosophy considers it to be another phenomenon. Kind of like a shadow, does nothing. It's just a byproduct of brain cells and whatnot. Or another way of looking at brain activity. That's pretty much what consciousness is believed to be within the scientific world. The alternative model is that the brain is more of a tuning device, that it tunes into some sort of energy. I don't like these words, energy, PSI, exosensory perception, because there's a lot of negative connotations around that. A lot of they're hippies, they're potheads, LSD users. It just goes down a very wrong road. And I try really hard to avoid that language. And so the alternative model is that the brain is a tuning device. You tune into some sort of, I don't know what it is, consciousness? I don't know. So what is consciousness? I'm going to do a little study. Everyone, you guys are all aware of what I'm saying right now, right? You hear my voice, you see me moving, you see my fingertips and all that. Now you're going to be conscious of the bottom of your feet. Now you're going to be conscious of the chair you're sitting on. Is it soft? Is it hard? And notice how your consciousness shifts from outside to within. Well, the best definition I could come up with, based off everything I've read, is that consciousness is awareness. You shift awareness. That's what it is. It's not learning, it's not thinking, it's not doing, it's awareness. So if you look at that white thing in the center, all right, laser zoom work? Yeah. You see the boundaries, it's right, it's pretty clear, right? This is consciousness, everything else is the unconscious. But as we zoom in, you see that the boundaries are actually really blurred. And depending on where you position yourself in relation to this thought is where you draw the boundaries for what consciousness is and what unconscious or whatever else is. So this is where the concept of it's all one, or if you zoom in far enough, you realize that everything is one. There is no me and him, you and I, everything is one. But if you go far enough, there's nothing. You're just a separate individual dot. So that's a really, I know it's an image, but it really, the work shows that this is kind of how it is. So let's add some credibility to all this. The U.S. government, military, NASA, and CIA individually funded studies on this thing called remote viewing, which utilized non-local consciousness. People would sit in a room and try to find missing personnel. They would try to spy on the Russians. This is back in the Soviet era. And so the CIA asked the statistics professor, Jessica Utz, in 1995 to write a report regarding they told her to take all this data. They were a statistics professor. Tell us, is remote viewing real? And this is what she had to say. She said, using the standards applied to any other area of science, it's concluded that psychic functioning has been well established. The statistical results of the studies examined are far beyond what is expected by chance. Argument that these studies could be due to methodological flaws in the experiences are soundly refuted. Effects of similar magnitude to those found in the government-sponsored research has been replicated in a number of laboratories across the world, and such consistency cannot be explained by claims of flaw or fraud. Okay? Now, this congressional, Charlie Rose, I don't know if he's a credible guy or not. I know he has a show, but I don't know if he's really credible. But he said something really interesting too. He's like, I like to say that if these results are faked, our security system does not work, because these people were able to identify highly secure targets in the United States and Russia, which were later verified with aerial photography. And he's like, if this is, if it's not real, then we have a shitty security system. So what we've covered, we kind of talked about the misconception of consciousness, localized nature of it, which is based off our senses. We kind of talked about the non-localized nature of consciousness. You're able to perceive something somewhere out there. Now, what are the implications of this? Primarily in psychotherapy, it's countertransference, because, Freudian, you don't think of countertransference. You're sitting in a room, you feel something, it's not your emotion, it's their emotion that you're kind of picking up on. There's a lot of evidence that kind of suggests that this isn't nonsense, that the behavioral view of countertransference, that it's all yours, that's not necessarily true, that it can be something transferred to you, something you pick up on from your patient. So I think within psychotherapy, this is the biggest implication, which I think it's really important that we pay attention to. Why? I don't remember why I put this, but why is it that we are mostly localized within our bodies and our minds and this present moment? Why? Well, it's a habit. I'm going to tell you why. We are fooled into thinking that we're trapped in our bodies and in the present moment. And so due to the neural limitations at birth, we have limited cognitions and our understanding is limited and therefore only based off our physical perception from the five senses. You're a baby, you need food to survive, so you cry, you get food. And all of a sudden this feedback loop begins of you thinking that there's a physical stimulation within, corresponds with the physical act of releasing sound waves, which corresponds to your mother feeding you and you being fed. And so that cycle is perpetuated at that age. And so that becomes one of the first and most engraved habits we develop beginning at birth, that we're trapped within this moment and within these bodies. So how do we get non-local? This is a very important thing for me. Two things, relaxation or emotion. You need to be completely relaxed so that you quiet mental noise to the point where you're able to identify kind of what is it that's coming into you, what your senses are feeding you. Because non-local consciousness is a very subtle shift in things. And Jung talks a lot about this, and I didn't mention any of that stuff, but he talks a lot about it. And in order to really feel that sudden shift and a change in neural activity, you need to be so relaxed where you distinguish your brain activity from some other thing that's coming into you. And I think in our current day and age, we're bombarded with so much sensory stimuli, we don't ever feel that. You need to be in complete and utter relaxation to be able to sense that. And also emotion. I don't know why, but intense emotion somehow works something in time and space which allows you to go in there and do your thing. So that is all. There's more slides. I just want to show you this picture. I'm not going to talk about any of this. I just want to show this picture. It's really cool. It's a laser beam. That was really cool.
You're really cool.
Thank you. If you have questions, just talk to me on the topic.
What about substances
Yes.
and non-local, the experience of non-local?
I'm sorry, say that one more time?
Hallucinogenic substances and the experience of changes in space-time. Since you mentioned
Okay,
emotion and relaxation.
Yeah, actually, I didn't want to add that
I
because...
bet not.
I didn't want to add that because, adding drugs to this... See, it was really hard for me to kind of write about this because it borders a lot of what's considered to be nonsense. And I eventually want to teach at like a local college or something, and to write something that most people consider to be nonsense I thought would be credible, and to add a lot of information about drug use and things like that. I just felt like it would not be a good thing for myself, but you can, I think it is possible, a lot of research shows that you can use hallucinating drugs to warp that concept of time and space and to kind of expand your awareness outside of your body. It's sad that a lot of us think we're trapped, but we're really not. You know? It really is sad. Have you guys heard the saying, if you tie an elephant to a tree when it's born, and when it's older you cut that cord, it'll never walk away past what the length of that rope was. Even if you cut that thing and try to drag it out. And that's kind of what we're like. We get stuck in our moment and bodies and we think this is it. But shamanism is something that you had told me to kind of help me explore. And there's a lot of incredible evidence about how shamanic healing, spiritual healing, it's not nonsense, that there's so much truth to all of that. And I don't even know where to go because I know I'm going to go on, it's going to just get sidetracked and it's going to get really boring, but all those things are kind of true. And yeah, if you have any questions. Yes, Andrea.
The study that you mentioned in the beginning with the two people.
Meditating, yeah.
Yeah, so can you just explain that one?
Sure.
So they don't know each other, right?
Well, I'm not sure if they do or don't know each other.
Okay,
I'm not sure about that part of it, but they would just sit there and meditate just together and be quiet for 20 minutes. Then they'd be separated in these rooms where there's nothing to go in or out, no electromagnetic radiation to go in or out, no radio waves, cell phone waves, and this person has a screen in front of them and sees colors, images, and when you see those things, he becomes aware that he's seeing them, and the brainwave activity shows that in the visual cortex. This other person here just sitting there, bored out of his mind, and they're recording his brain activity, which shows the same pattern of his visual cortex being lit up as this guy. And that was just one couple. It was statistically relevant.
Right. So the idea is that they get attuned to each other somehow in that little bit of
Yes,
time,
yes.
and then they have separate, one has an experience that the other one can reflect.
Exactly. And that's where quantum physics come in, because only in the quantum world do you couple two particles and you take them apart, and if something happens to this one, something happens to that one too. It's like they have some memory of one another. And a recent study was published in Israel, I think a week ago, that two photons can interact like months apart from one another. So it's not just space, it's with time. They have studies shown that things can interact independent of time, which isn't a surprise, but it's pretty cool that they actually show that. Yes? Were you going to say
Well, I was
something?
just going to say that also it just makes me think about human relationships and how
Yes, exactly,
the way
yeah.
that people can just keep vibrating off each other.
Yeah, I think, no, it's not, yeah, I didn't even touch on it, but that's so true about the value of kind of opening your heart as you approach someone. Something happens. I don't know what, but something happens. And I think in therapy, as therapists, that's the most important thing. For us to be so in tune to our brainwave activity, our thoughts, and open our hearts to such a degree where we can tune our patients and navigate them to the waters. But, Gons, were you going to say something?
You said you were thinking of maybe teaching at a local school, and so I was just thinking in college or something, and so and you mentioned the elephant with the thing, and so I was just bringing it up to you, you'd consider teaching at a non-local school, or if you so wrap it up. Anyway, it's just my mind and
I'm a little confused right now. Are you trying to, are you going back to Texas? Is this where it's leading to? No, I understand, that's funny. So you guys have any other questions?
I just have a comment.
Sure.
I was glad to hear you share about the dream that your friend had, which was the exact same thought that you were experiencing, and then putting that in context of the therapeutic relationship. I remember in our first year, I was working in a clinic with schizophrenic residents, and I had an experience where I was sitting next to a client and I drew a picture of this very specific creature, and he looked at it, and we were making drawings with each other, and then he shared that he had been having a dream of that image for the last 2 weeks. And I remember it really scared me, and I was worried and got all caught up in myself that I was starting to go where he was going. And so I think it's really great to be able to contextualize those kinds of non-localized experiences so that we don't take them so personal, or I don't take them to be like, you know, an indication of where we are just at that time. Kind of lets you detach.
Yeah, it does.
Yeah.
It does. Yeah, thanks for sharing that. I mean, I think all of us have experienced that phenomenon, but most people, like my brother, would totally disregard that. It's just chance. He's sitting right there. He believes in chance and all that nonsense. Anything else? Yes?
Yeah, I think that also it gives us therapists an opportunity to think that, well, if all this non-local connection is going on all the time, then our job also, besides being just in the room with whatever's going on, is to keep this very spacious awareness going on during our sessions and in life, you know, a very positive outlook. So it really encourages all of us to remain positive and to keep that out there, because if we're all connected, it all helps,
Yeah,
you know?
that's absolutely true. I think I'm done. I think there was something.